hands are too shaky for this. I'm making too many happy little accidents.
Started off with a very simple sketch, mostly just to get the position of the head within the overall composition. The most important thing is that the face is not too small, and my general rule of thumb is that the face should be at least as big as my fist. I'm going to start by putting down a mid-tone value, and this should be a value that's about halfway between the lightest light and the darkest dark on this painting. So this painting, the light is not terribly bright, but the dark is very dark. Which makes evaluating or judging the mid-tone very difficult against the whiteness of the canvas. So since we're working with an unstained canvas here, it can be difficult to find the right mid-tone. So what I do is I also put down the darkest value, which is just under the hairline. And that gives me a kind of a gauge to evaluate my mid-tone and hopefully arrive at an accurate mid-tone. Just using straight raw umber for the darkest values on the face. That gives me something very close to black, but it preserves just a little bit of headroom, if you will, for even darker values later. For the flesh tones of the face, I'm using a very simple palette, just alizarin crimson, phthalo green, cadmium yellow light, and titanium white. My preference is to keep a very simple palette with just those three colors. I just find it much easier to maintain color harmony throughout the rest of the painting. I will add blue later when it comes to the background and to his shirt, but for now I'm just sticking with green, red, and yellow. The rest of the block-in stage, I'm primarily just trying to cover the white of the canvas. I'm not terribly interested in being very precise with my shapes, although maybe just a little bit around the mouth and the eyes. I'm also not very interested in the color accuracy. I'm being very cautious with the values, with the contrast, but the color, I find it a little bit easier later on to bring up the saturation or tone down the saturation of the color than it is to necessarily fix a wrong value. So at this stage, it's about big shapes, it's about value. I am paying a bit more attention to color on the beard because it's so much different than the flesh tone. And so here I'm just mixing up my own gray using alizarin crimson and phthalo green. Those are complementary colors, so if you mix them together you get black, and then add a little bit of titanium white to make a gray color. I like to mix my own gray because inevitably it's not perfect, and so there's quite a bit of variation in the gray that you mix by hand, and I think that adds a lot of interest. It also is just a little bit easier sometimes just to pull the gray a little bit cooler or a little bit warmer than if you're starting with some gray from a tube, or black, for example. For areas outside of the face, I'm going to switch to using a larger brush. This is, I believe, a number 10 flat. The purpose of that is to paint with less detail in the places that are not the focal interest. So the focal interest should have more detail than other areas. Another good reason to do it is that a variation in detail throughout a painting is another way to add interest. I grew up watching Bob Ross, in the 80s and 90s, I guess. Watched him on PBS. He always said that he thought anybody could learn to paint. Interestingly, Bob Ross did not really paint people into his pictures. In fact, I'm only aware of a single instance that he painted a person, and it was just a silhouette of a person, actually. So he filmed around or just over, I think, 400 episodes, and only in one did he paint a person. I sometimes wonder why. In my case, at least, I feel like I'm much better at painting people than I am at painting landscapes. So for me, I'd much rather paint a happy little person than I would a happy little tree. So we're past the block in now. This stage is about refining shapes, getting ever more smaller shapes, correcting color, correcting values, and just restating things over and over. At this point, I've switched from my number 6 flat brush to a smaller number 4 filbert brush. A filbert's just going to give a nice soft edge and be a little bit easier to paint the details. This stage can take a long time. There's a lot of stepping back, trying to get perspective, trying to make sure that the features are in the right place and that the likeness is correct. And then a lot of just minor adjustments to things, pushing the paint around, pushing the colors. You'll see here I'm just going to be adding a little bit of red to the cheeks and a little bit of green, cooler colors to the bottom of the chin. In addition to his phrase, happy trees, he had another one, which was happy little accidents. And by that, he meant any kind of painting mistake that often just became a fortuitous mistake. And I think he was just trying to encourage his viewers and his students to embrace the process of painting, embrace sometimes just the randomness that happens, because it's part of what makes a painting instead of a photograph. The more you try for perfection, sometimes the worse the results are.
You take Mr. Bean next to me.
You want to say that closer to the camera?
What?
Bring in the camera.
Are you recording?
Yeah.
Oh!
State your request. Bob Ross mostly, although not always, painted wet into wet, which means that he painted with just wet paint. The paint was never allowed to dry. He wasn't painting on top of a layer of dried paint. Except in a few rare instances. I have seen some episodes where he had kind of an underpainting using acrylic, and then he would paint oil paint over top of that. But mostly it was wet into wet, which is what this entire portrait here today is as well. There's no dried underpainting. For the painting within a painting, I decided to try to emulate the master himself, and I covered the white part of the canvas with a layer of titanium white. And then, which is the first time I've tried this, by the way, just painting over a layer of white paint. It was an interesting experience, and I can see the appeal. It's just very easy to blend colors in, and I'm not even specifically really trying very hard. I want this part of the portrait to be very loose, very unfinished, and not draw attention away from the face itself. Basically, my thought process was that in order to make this painting within the painting look like a painting, it needed to look more like a painting than the rest of the painting, if that makes any sense at all. And that's it. For the finishing touches, we'll just add a little bit of ultramarine blue, some sap green, and some Indian yellow to his palette. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. As Bob Ross would say, God bless. We'll see you next time.
My hands are too shaky for this. I'm making too many happy little accents.